I'm going to introduce now Inez Stepman, who's a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. The Family Policy Alliance is pleased to partner with the Independent Women's Forum on saving girls' sports. And you've just been doing such a great job on this issue. And thank you for being here with us today. Tell us about the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. So the Independent Women's Forum and the Independent Women's Voice is an organization that is dedicated to policies that actually create prosperity and opportunity for women and, frankly, for men as well, instead of paying lip service to the ideals of equality or women's opportunity. We want to enact policies and promote policies that actually achieve that on the ground in a real way. And that's exactly why we oppose the Equality Act. It pays lip service to equality while it ensures inequality for women. So what worries me the most about this bill is that it erases women as a legal category. And that is something that has so much more than rhetorical consequences, right? We all saw the House rules that exchanged all gendered language, and largely that was a political stunt, although it was a political stunt with an underlying ideology that I think is quite dangerous. But at the end of the day, that was rhetorical. This bill is not rhetorical. It has real consequences because our current law has the flexibility to recognize biological differences between men and women. And in fact, the law relies on recognizing those differences for all kinds of laws that Americans take for granted day to day. And I don't think a lot of Americans are aware of how much this law, this Equality Act, so-called Equality Act, would affect those laws that do recognize the reality of biological sex. So, for example, the law relies on that flexibility to recognize those biological differences when it extends opportunities to girls. It protects single-sex spaces, and even sometimes to protect the safety of women and girls and protect them from unique vulnerabilities that come with being female. So I'll give you some concrete examples of what I mean. For example, we currently segregate women and men in prisons. Right? It should be very obvious to all of us why that's the case. Women have unique vulnerabilities, and if female prisoners are placed in with men, I don't think we have to spell it out, right? That women have unique vulnerabilities because they're physically weaker, and that we take into account that biological reality when we separate men and women's prisons. This law would threaten that, right? Same thing with school locker rooms or bathrooms, right? In public schools, we're talking about, as previous speakers have mentioned, we're talking about, the ability to have some privacy, especially for girls who are, going through puberty and are already, awkward enough and want privacy about their bodies. It's simply not fair to them to force them to say that you have to be comfortable with being with biological males in a locker room. And then, of course, there is the much discussed example of women's sports, right? We've seen this in Connecticut where female track runners have had to compete against male-bodied athletes, and frankly, they're losing, right? There are 2 transgender athletes that are now taking basically the top 2 spots in virtually every track meet in a particular district in Connecticut. And girls have actually spoken out about that, about the scholarship opportunities that they might miss out on. And more than that, the degradation of the effort that they've put in when they're put in a competition that just biologically they can't win. One of those runners, I think, really eloquently spoke about how she felt after training for months and months and months and years even, and then to see somebody just blow by her without any effort whatsoever, and knowing that no matter how hard she trained, she could never beat that person. That was really devastating. But it's not just about track teams and losing out on scholarships. It's also physically dangerous sometimes, depending on the sport, to put biological men in with women. And we saw that with the MMA fight between Fallon Fox and her opponent, an actual XX female opponent. she ended up getting a broken orbital bone, right? Because, and she said it was just an overwhelming force, that fighting against a biological man was just an overwhelming force, right? And she's an MMA fighter. There are also, all kinds of grants for things like women's shelters and STEM opportunities for girls. Each one of those grants would be then scrutinized, or the recipients of those grants would have to go to court in order to defend their right, and perhaps lose in court, to defend their right to only serve women. We saw this we've seen it in Alaska already, where a women's shelter was sued for turning away a biological man. Now we're talking about, a shelter that's supposed to be a haven for domestic violence victims, and bringing a man into that shelter would sort of defeat the purpose in a large sense of the shelter's work. But they're being sued. So these cases are already happening throughout the country because of bad state law or bad state regulatory policy. But this law would raise that to federal law, and it would make it a blanket case across all 50 states. And it would take away the American people's ability to actually balance inclusion and sort of individual treatment of transgender individuals with the rights of women and girls, with the rights to privacy. So I worry that this law will short circuit our ability to talk about this issue and solve it on an individual or local level, and will just simply be a blanket federal law, a blunt instrument to override the concerns that I think actually, if those consequences were made more well known through the media, I think the majority of the American people would agree that they're reasonable concerns. So the Equality Act has a really nice sounding name. But it's really terrible policy, and the name is just papering over the huge consequences, particularly for women and girls, of erasing sex as a legal category from our law.